All right. Hi, everybody. It's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of The Michael Shermer Show. It's brought to you always by the Skeptic Society and Skeptic Magazine. Hey, here's our new issue. Do animals think? Or we know they think. What do they think, right? What's that chimp thinking holding that human brain? You can get your copy of Skeptic at skeptic.com/magazine or go to any fine bookstore where we've been carried since the early 90s. All right, my guest today is Edward Goldberg. He's a leading expert in the area of where global politics and economics intercepts. He teaches international political economy at the New York University Center for Global Affairs, where he is an adjunct assistant professor. He's also a scholarly practitioner at the Zicklin Graduate School of Business of Baruch College in City University of New York, where he teaches courses on globalization. With over 30 years of experience in international business and as a former member of President Barack Obama's Election Foreign Policy Network team, Dr. Goldberg is the author of Why Globalization Works for America, How Nationalist Trade Policy Destroys Countries, The Joint Ventured Nation, Why America Needs a New Foreign Policy, and he's a much-quoted essayist and public speaker on the subjects of globalization, European-American relations, U.S.-Russia, and China relations, which you may have noticed is rather current these days. He has commented on these issues on PBS, NPR, CBS, Bloomberg, the New York Times, The Hill, and the Huffington Post, and here's his new book. It's called The United States as Global Liberal Hegemon, How the U.S. Came to Lead the World. All right. Hey, Edward, nice to see you. How are you? Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
All right. So what's your story? How did you get into all this study of international affairs?
Oh, always interested. And then actually I started as an international business person first and worked for a very dynamic company that was involved in Russia and China. And then just evolved, went from international trade finance into academia. Which actually is very useful because it gives me, I look at the world in a more pragmatic way, I think, than many academics. So combining both is very, very useful.
Yeah, I'll say. So, and your work is obviously incredibly important and ripping the headlines right off the front pages with Russia, China, Israel, and Iran. I just go on. It's astonishing. So your inbox must be full, and you must get up in the morning and go, okay, let's see who invaded who.
Right, exactly. Who invaded who?
All right. So what do you mean by hegemon? What is a hegemon? You mean we're the world's police? Something like
Well,
that?
a hegemon is basically the leading power. It's a Greek word, as it's obvious, and it comes from the Greek city-states, Athens fighting Sparta, in who was the hegemon. And then we go on, I call the United States a liberal hegemon. And that's an interesting word because it's liberal, the old classic definition of liberal, which is used in political science. Today we use liberal as a pejorative word. Someone is almost a socialist or communist, they're liberal. But in classic political science or in international relations, liberal refers to the original meaning from the Enlightenment in England, from the John Locke's meaning of someone who believes in the individual who is more important than the state, as someone who believes in the rule of law, and as someone who believes in a liberal capitalist economic system.
Yeah, that's certainly not the way the word is often used today, although I
No,
often think,
if you listen to the talking heads, liberal is totally
yeah,
different than that.
really, I think we just need a new word, maybe progressive, what some people call it. Some people on the far left call themselves progressives. Maybe that's different than how you mean it.
That's a better use.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so this idea of the Enlightenment emphasis on individual rights, autonomy, self-determination, and so on, bumps up against these other social pressures that we're a nation, we're a team. There are other nations and teams that maybe we like and those that maybe we don't like or they don't like us. So you have that tension there between individuality and the social good, I guess.
Oh, definitely. And I think most so here in the United States. In the United States, we're basically the only major power that was born during the Enlightenment. And it's become part of our, there's a great word, path dependency, which means something that happened way back influences how a country behaves. Well, the Enlightenment and individuality has become part of our path dependency. So look what happened during the pandemic, where everyone said, who's the government? What right has the government to tell me I need to wear a mask? Or what right has the government told me that I need to get injected against the disease? I mean, this is the concept of individual that is so strong in the United States that, it's even, I think, problematic because we see as the world becomes more and more connected, as pandemics go back and forth around the world. We're sure to get another one as we have economic contagion. Um, you know, you need a sense of community. And the idea, the Enlightenment idea, doesn't foster a sense of community. What it does foster is great entrepreneurialism. So the U.S. has been able to lead the world in that kind of technological entrepreneurialism because of the role of the individual. But maybe you now need more of a balance. And I think this could be a problem going forward for the United States. How do you get community?
Yeah. So historically speaking, on the Enlightenment, it wasn't born here in America. I mean, there's the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, and the French Enlightenment with the French philosophes, Rousseau and so forth, Voltaire. Then there were German Enlightenment. So how come it mainly flourished here and not some of these other
Well,
countries?
it's a good question. No, of course it wasn't. It was born in our mother country to a certain extent, more in Scotland than in England. Uh, but Europe has had, we've only had the history of the individual. Europe has also had the history of the king and queen. And the king and queen has a responsibility to look after its citizens. So we see, for instance, in Europe, no one questions that the medical system is run by the government. They could argue that it's not efficient, which they constantly do in the UK, but no one questions it's the right of the government to run the medical system. Because once again, the sovereign looks after, quote, its children. And here in the United States, the individual is the sovereign, back to true Enlightenment theory. And so we say, what right does the government tell us what doctor we have to choose? It's interesting about that argument because, of course, no one says, what right does the insurance company have to tell us what doctor we have to use? But that's a whole other story.
Yeah, because of our emphasis on privatization of
Right.
services like that. So the extreme version of this would be like Hobbes's Leviathan, that we are giving up our rights to this Leviathan that's going to take care of us.
I think so, yes. Yeah, I think so. And I think in today's world, community is very important, as we saw during the pandemic. You know, I don't know if many of your audiences are familiar with the old Broadway show Oklahoma. And Oscar Hammerstein wrote a little jingle in it about, we go out, it's about the difference between the cowboy and the farmer. And the farmer wants the land to be free to roam and raise his cattle and cattle eat all over. And the farmer wants the land to be fenced in and wants villages. And to a certain extent, and I realize this is a stretch, you could see Donald Trump with his entrepreneurial real estate background being against zoning laws, being against all these things that hedge in the rancher, representing the cowboy again, vis-a-vis the idea of community.
Yeah, interesting. Well, the whole history of the Western United States was that tension playing out as states, as territories wanted to become states, and the long arm of the law took a long time to get out there.
Yeah,
And so you had a lot of self-help justice.
right.
Did you ever see the movie The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance?
No,
John
but
Wayne.
I know about it, of course. Yep.
I mean, it is that tension, right? There's Liberty Valance is this kind of blackguard, gunman, and John Wayne is the good guy gunman, and Jimmy Stewart plays the lawman who wants to do everything legally, and so the three of them have to play out their different roles
Well,
as the
so
Western
it's
town
similar.
develops.
It's
Yeah,
similar to the Jingo in Oklahoma.
right. That's really funny. All right, so how did this unfold historically? That is our hegemonic propensities. Didn't Washington in his farewell address say, we're not going to get involved in European affairs?
Oh, well, now it's slightly changing subject here. Okay, yeah, yeah. Washington gave a very actually it's a beautiful speech if you go back and read it, and I'm always amazed that Donald Trump, who I think has never taken a history course in his life. But Donald Trump, I mean, it's the perfect speech to quote to defend his position of getting out of NATO, not having allies. It's to quote George Washington's speech. I'm
Yeah.
amazed that he doesn't do this, but I think that just shows where he is in terms of being a historian. Um, yeah, but the problem with George Washington's speech is that it's read in 1795, and the world has changed greatly. So it's a gorgeous speech about not being involved in Europe, and specifically in European affairs. But we're not living in George Washington's world.
That's right. Yeah, the Second Amendment. You can have all the breech loading muskets you want that take 2 minutes
Right,
to load and
exactly.
fire.
Exactly.
That's really funny. Here's what you write. In the 1940s, when America anointed itself hegemon, somewhat like Great Britain in the 19th century, American foreign policy was largely, aside from Harry Truman and a few others, dominated by a group of men who generally all went to the similar prep schools and graduated from Princeton, Yale, or Harvard. This has changed drastically. If there's one common domestic thread in America post World War II history, it is how American society and political life has become noticeably more diverse. Okay, let's unpack some of that. When did our hegemonic tendencies begin? I guess during World War II?
Yeah, I think basically we could say Franklin Roosevelt is the birth mother of our hegemonic position. Um, it's interesting. Franklin Roosevelt was always an internationalist, and was very much for the League of Nations, which we know we did not join, and campaigned throughout the country for the League of Nations, gave an extensive amount of speeches. He realized the need for the U.S. to be in the world game. And shortly before we entered World War II, he proposed the Four Freedoms speech in his State of the Union speech about why it's necessary for the U.S. to be involved. And as I said, he was the birth mother of this, of the U.S. being involved. And of course, what was happening, the world was totally falling apart, as we know. Britain was in a horrible position, basically being constantly bombed by the Nazis. Japan was in China. um, Russia was attacked, even though they had the treaty with the Nazis. So the world was in a horrible place, and there was only one major power that, to a certain extent, could halt the disaster, and that was the United States.
Right. So it really begins our dramatic hegemonic tendencies December 7th, 1941, I guess, when the isolationists no longer have a voice.
Right, the isolationists, you know, of course, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there was, isolationism ran out the window. Um, but isolationism in America is it's like whack-a-mole. It goes away and then always comes back up, and we're always, I think, fighting it. And the further as the world gets further into globalization and interconnectedness, the isolationist argument loses more and more the rationality of the isolationist argument. I mean, look at the difference today just in industry. Um, it used to be you would measure a nation's wealth by fixed assets, how many steel mills, how many car factories. Now, fixed assets are not so important. Manufacturing's not so important. Human capital and ideas that you could sell around the world are important. So, Google, what type of fixed assets does Google have? What type of fixed assets really do any of these companies have? So, the world is the marketplace. So, isolationism even becomes less relevant.
Or even destructive of our economy.
Right.
Or restrictive
Yes.
anyway. Yeah. 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 Just another historical question. So going back to, say, the First World War and right after, and President Wilson's attempt to pitch the United Nations, but there was also the idea of self-determination. Countries should be free and autonomous to determine themselves, but then we also need some sort of a global policeman like the United Nations or
Well,
the League of Nations.
The idea of the League was mutual defense against aggression. It didn't work for several reasons. One, because we took our chips and went home. So World War I ends. We are the leading economic power by that time. And we say we want to just go home and party. So we leave it and go to the roaring 20s. And we even work against it. So, for instance, the one of the tools the League of Nations had was sanction power. So Italy invades Ethiopia. The League of Nations sanctions Italy. But because we're not in the League of Nations, we sell oil to Italy. So we even undermine the structure.
Right. Yeah. So why can't there be a global policeman? Well, I guess we are of sorts, but there's always going to be some restrictions. Not everybody wants to play the game.
Well, I firmly believe, and I started my latest book on the U.S. as global liberal hegemon. Not so sure if we need one and if the U.S. should be it. Writing the book, and I'm a child of the 60s. I'm a child of U.S. disasters, of Vietnam, okay? So I said, what right do we have to play this role? In fact, the original title of the book was going to be Who Anointed the United States? And the more I got into it and the more research I did, I saw that the world definitely needs it. The natural tendency of the world is chaos on a geopolitical global sense. I mean, you have all the different cultures, all the different histories, and all the different geographies. So the natural tendency is chaos. But you can't have a chaos. You can't, it's not so good for survival, to say the least. So you need some form of hegemonic power. The League of Nations did not work. Henry Kissinger wrote about the balance of power during the Congress of Vienna, which was the end of the Napoleonic Wars. But that basically fell apart with World War One. Then during the Cold War, we had what was called MAD, or mutual assured destruction, to keep peace, to keep chaos away. And that was MAD, which is part of John von Neumann's string theory, was the fact that if Russia would nuke us. The Soviet Union would nuke us, our cities. We would nuke the Soviet Union cities, and we would both be destroyed. So there was no logic to a nuclear war, mutual assured destruction. Okay, that worked a bit, I must say, although it was a terrifying theory.
Still has worked so far, with a few close calls.
Right. But the United Nations, which then, came about during World War II, was supposed to solve a lot of these problems. And it's been a wonderful institution, except for this week here in my hometown of New York, where it's blocked all the traffic. But it's been a wonderful institution if you're a small country, if you're dealing with any of its UN subsidiaries or branches like the WHO or the Treaty of the Oceans or any of these things. It's basically worked on many levels. But in terms of big power conflict, it can't work how its structure is set up because of the veto power of the Security Council. So any of the nations on the Security Council can veto any action. I mean, the great story here is the one time the veto power didn't work, and for sure they've learned tremendously from it, was when it was first used. When North Korea in 1950-51 invaded South Korea, we went to the United Nations and to the Security Council and said, the UN should go in with a military force against us because one country has invaded another country. Well, normally the Soviet Union would have vetoed that. But the ambassador of the Soviet Union had decided was boycotting the Security Council that week because he and Stalin were angry that Taiwan had the China seat and not Mao. So because they were boycotting it, they couldn't be there to veto it, which is a great story. And of course, they've learned never to do that again, right?
Yeah, right.
That was an instant lesson. But the UN truly, whether it was the Vietnam War or the Iraq War or go on and on and on, whenever there's a big power conflict, the UN is neutered. Even to the extent some of the conflicts in Africa, where the killings have been just dramatic, but China has vetoed action because China is relying on those countries for raw materials.
Right. Do sanctions work for the most part to attenuate conflicts, even if they don't zero them out?
Sanctions, I believe, are debatable. They have worked in some areas. Sanctions did work in South Africa, without a doubt. Sanctions did work originally with Iran and nuclear development. Sanctions got Iran to the table. So they work sometimes. And other times, Russia's been able to find ways to run around the sanctions now.
All right, just a few more points on the philosophy behind all this. You quote Roosevelt's State of the Union address, January 6, 1941. No realistic American can expect from a dictator's peace, international generosity, or return of true independence, or world disarmament, or freedom of expression, or freedom of religion, or even good business. Such a peace would bring no security for us or for our neighbors. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. Wow, that's such a great quote. He's kind of laying it out there.
It is really, and you can take that quote and put it to today's world.
Yeah. Well, you do with Blinken's quote, whether we like it or not, the world does not organize itself. So You're arguing that somebody has to do this. It's chaos otherwise, and we're the only ones that can do it.
Well, yeah, I think if one looks at, so one could ask the question, why the United States? Once again, I'll to my original title, Who Anointed America? Um, we have tremendous advantages that other countries don't have. We're the lucky country. Um, Geography, we're the blessed country. We have the two oceans, gives us a natural sense of security. We're food self-sufficient. We're energy self-sufficient. We have a great river system. We have two neighbors. Our northern neighbor is almost like our good twin, if we're twins. And our southern neighbor, the only problem we have with our southern neighbors, they all want to move here. Not all, but there are many people want to migrate here. So I mean, this should be the biggest problem anyone has with their neighbors in the world. No other major power has that advantage besides the size of our economy. You look at take a look at Russia. I mean, Russia it doesn't have its economy's the size of Spain. Massive Russia. The economy's the size of Spain. Uh, um, and it has really no entrepreneurial development. Its neighbors hate it. Um, you you have the same thing in China. The neighbors hate it, and China's actually a worse position because for a lot of their shipments for food and energy, they're dependent upon the Straits of Malacca outside of Singapore. Um, so that they're really not in a good geographic position. So the U.S. is the only one that, in a way, from geography and economics and energy, that has freedom to act.
Yeah. And so why do we do it? So there's the economic, political realism aspect, but there's also the moral component. I mean, don't we have a moral obligation to help those people who are oppressed by dictators and crappy governments and so on?
We do have a moral obligation, but I think that becomes a little sticky.
Hmm.
It was, I think, John Adams who said, we're a believer in democracy, but we'll only fight, I'm paraphrasing badly, but the fight is here in this country. We'll support, but not get involved to a certain extent. So we have a moral obligation, but at what point do we get involved and not get involved? So that becomes a little sticky. But I think we do have we are the major beneficiaries from globalization. We are the major beneficiaries from world trade. And I think in that point, we do have an obligation to support the rule of law. And I think that's, separate that from the moral obligation. We have distinct rules of law. I mean, let's look what happened in Eastern Europe with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Since 1648, most of the world has believed in what's called the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. Nations are independent, don't invade nations. Forgetting about how horrible the Nazis were, it's as a moral culture. One of the reasons we went to World War II was because Hitler invaded everybody. One of the reasons we went to World War II is because Japan invaded China and then, of course, attacked Japan. Nations are not supposed to invade other nations in the Westphalian concept of sovereignty. Well, Russia in 1994 signed what's called the Budapest Memorandum, which was with the United States and the UK and the Russian Federation, that said, Ukraine, you give up your nuclear weapons, which were there from the Soviet days, and we guarantee your territorial integrity. Russia signed it. It was a document they signed. It's not something that was just imagined. And the Yeltsin signatures on it. And so Russia invades Ukraine, which is the first major European, first time since the end of World War II where a treaty was violated openly and where Westphalian concepts were violated. They broke the law. And if you say this one could break the law, well, the next person can break the law. To a certain extent, a cop needs to hand out tickets, else a cop is not respected. And if someone breaks the law, doesn't get punished for it, the next person doesn't, and then the chaos increases.
So the economic sanctions imposed on Russia after the annexation of Crimea just wasn't big enough ticket.
Yeah, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And in fact, the Crimea is not as black and white as the invasion of the Ukraine. Crimea was a part of Russia, and Khrushchev. Think of Crimea as whether the Statue of Liberty in Liberty Island in New York Harbor belongs to New York State or New York or New Jersey. Okay? During the Soviet Union days, Khrushchev said that in order to get support on something he needed to do within the Soviet Union, said Crimea is now part of the Ukraine, where previous to Khrushchev saying that, it was part of Russia.
Interesting.
So it's Ukraine.
So that's
not
Putin's argument
black
now.
and white as I'm sorry, Crimea is not clearly as black. It was a no because it was part of Ukraine.
And is that the case with the Donbass region as well? It's a little grayish.
Not as much. Not as much. But I'm just saying the Crimea was part of the Ukraine. It was part of this Budapest memorandum. So in that part, Russia did recognize it as part of the Ukraine. Okay? But from a historical point of view, it's more recent. It's a more recent part of Ukraine.
Right. And if Russia didn't have nukes, would any of this be happening? I mean, the attention he gets.
I didn't hear you.
If Russia didn't have nuclear weapons.
It would be much easier for Biden. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, look at the problem Biden has now. Obama, who I think in general was a very good president, I think made one large foreign policy mistake, and that's when Syria, Assad gassed its people, which there has been, and once again, this gets back to the cop handing out tickets. There has been an international convention against gassing people since the end of World War I. Recognized, it's now part of the UN Charter. It's recognized by everyone. Assad gasses its people. Okay. Obama goes on national TV and makes an absolutely brilliant speech of how this is truly not to be. Brilliant speech. And then a day or 2 days later, he decides not to act after his brilliant speech. So, I mean, it would have, of course, it would have possibly killed some people. And I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it would have been easy and part of in my mind, president's responsibility as a hegemon to lob a couple of missiles into Syria and to show that as the then liberal hegemon, we do give out tickets, and this is a no-no. By the way, possibly there's a dotted line there to Putin thinking it's okay to go into the Ukraine.
Mm.
Possibly. One never knows how anyone thinks. But my point here is Obama's decision, and I realize it was a decision where maybe 1 or 100 people might be killed. Okay, so it's not an easy decision. I'm not saying it's easy, but it was an easier decision than Biden has now about letting the Ukraine use American long-range missiles into
Mm.
Russia,
Mm-hmm.
because that can directly lead to an atomic war where lobbing a couple of missiles in Syria would not have any effect in that matter whatsoever. So
What
Biden's in a much more difficult place.
what's the worst case scenario in that Putin uses tactical nuclear weapons because the war is failing with traditional military technology?
I would think so, but I am not in any way an expert on military technology, but I would think that would be the way he would go. And then what would be our reaction? Because, of course, no one has used tactical or any type of weapons since any type of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki.
Right. Yeah. The taboo is pretty strong,
Right.
including the taboo against gassing people. Even Hitler didn't use gas in World War II, at least
Right.
on the
Even he,
battlefield,
well,
although
he
he
did
used it
someplace.
elsewhere. Yeah.
He didn't. He did use it in the battlefield. He used it in the showers.
Yes, exactly. Right. No, I
Yeah.
know. Yeah. Okay. So what could unfold in a positive way? What's the Putin's off ramp out of Ukraine if he can't win militarily, where he doesn't lose face and have to do something drastic like use nuclear weapons?
I think the off ramp is, and once again, this depends upon our election.
Hmm.
Putin's life becomes more difficult if Harris wins. Putin's life becomes much easier if Trump wins. So if Trump wins, it's I think obvious that there would be a treaty of some sort to end the war. Russia would get the chunk of Ukraine it now occupies, and everyone would be forget about it until Russia goes to invade it again to get
Right.
some more land.
Right.
So that's the Trump part of it. I think if Harris wins and she continues the Biden effort, which all her speeches and conversations said she's definitely committed to, um, it becomes much more difficult for Russia. And we talked briefly about sanctions. I said sanctions were working so, but they are working and they are hurting the Russian establishment. They're hurting the Russian, they're hurting the Putin's cronies. We know through history, and I don't know if history is a lesson or not, but it's a guide to a certain extent. We know through history when the Russians army in the Russian establishment things are not going well for a certain amount of time, they tend to overthrow the czar. Uh, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but we know, for instance, I mean, I talked about historical lines. There's almost a direct historical line from the Russians losing the war against Japan in 1903 and the fall of the Tsar 14 years later. I mean, the Russian establishment realized that they are a very backward country. they thought, hey, it's a no-brainer to defeat these Asians. Well, these Asians had turned into a very major industrial country, unlike Russia, and they were able to destroy the Russian Pacific Fleet.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned game theory. I think it's one of the most important things any diplomat could study to figure these things out. The problem of overthrowing Putin in game theory is called belling the cat. This is where all the mice get together and decide it would be really good if they put a bell around the cat so they could hear him coming as a safety measure. But who's going to be the first one to get up there and put the bell around the cat and get eaten, right? So
Yeah,
Putin.
but one, what? Once again, you never know how this happens. It's just it's. I think that's you can't. I don't think that bell cat theory is so applicable because it becomes so much in flux.
You mean there might be some people working within the government who could overthrow him that we just don't even know who they are?
Correct. You just don't know. But I think if the war continues, and don't forget also what's going to happen is the body bags are going to start to come home. You can't hide that.
Yeah.
Even with controlling the press, you can't hide the whispering, "Oh, where's your son?"
Right. What was that
Uh,
called in the United States where they were bringing body bags to a military facility back east somewhere, and people started taking pictures and posting them? And I think that was even during
I'm sorry, I didn't
Vietnam.
hear you.
Oh, in the United States, I think it was during Vietnam, where there was a military base where soldiers were being brought back, and then the media started covering that.
Correct. And one actually, there's been some things written. The reason the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan was because it was the same time as Gorbachev liberated the press, and people started to hear about the body bags.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. In a counterfactual, do you think had something different happened with Yeltsin at that turning point where he was falling apart physically, mentally, politically? And he appointed one guy and then he appointed another guy, and it just as a replacement, it just didn't work out. Then he just kind of randomly plucked Putin out of obscurity and said, "You run it for a while and see how it goes." And here we are. That was like in the late 90s.
Right. Well, I think basically Yeltsin suffered from severe alcoholism.
Suffer that was his biggest problem.
Correct.
Yeah, I see. But what if we had intervened in your hegemonic way? If we had said, okay, we're going to do a Marshall Plan for Russia now
Well,
that
it's interesting. I've thought a lot about that actually, and written some essays about it. Um, I think one of the internal faults we did was we won the Cold War, a major, major international war. Did you ever see a parade for it?
no,
You know,
right,
I think I think a country needs to develop its own or have its own pride, and victories need to be celebrated. And we were very hesitant to celebrate it because one, we didn't want to antagonize the new Russian government. Two, some people in our government believed that maybe the the bad guys would come back, and we didn't want to give them an excuse. So we didn't have a parade. We had no celebration for the end of the Cold War.
no mission accomplished
No,
speech
we
on
really
the
did accomplish something.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
we have
yeah,
no statues to George Kennan, of course, but there was no parade. It was never so. So if you didn't have a parade, you couldn't have had a Marshall Plan.
right. I see. Right. Yeah.
It just wouldn't have worked politically. What we did, I mean, it was I met during that time, I mean, it's a great story. I met a young Russian business person here in New York, and he told me, there was rampant thievery and basically economic anarchy that
Hmm.
happened during Yeltsin's time in power. And this young man at the time told me that, you told us we have to have banks because remember, the country wasn't monetarized until the way we know it, until they formed the Soviet Union. He said, you told us we had to have banks, but you never told us the purpose of the banks was to take money from the savers and lend it out to industry to invest. You never told us that. So we thought we could take that money and send it to Switzerland. He was being
Right.
facetious, but it was absolutely true. We really didn't guide them in how to become a modern liberal capitalist state.
Right. So we end up with a kleptocracy essentially, and here we are.
Totally using Tom Friedman's word, kleptocracy. Absolutely correct.
Yeah. 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 All right. Before we get into some of the other hotspots, make the case against, say, RFK Jr., Tucker Carlson, Trump, and so on. What do I care? I'm just a middle class American doing my thing, raising my family. What happens in Ukraine or Israel or Taiwan gets annexed by China? What difference does it make to me? I'm just trying to live my life.
I get back to Neville Chamberlain's favorite famous quote about when the Nazis went into Czechoslovakia. And he said, it's a small country far away from here.
Right.
I think that answers it perfectly, right?
Yeah, except it wasn't that the argument for Vietnam, the domino theory. And
No. Yeah,
no,
yes. And of course, yeah. Look, one of the problems of being hegemons is we're not Plato's philosopher king. We make mistakes
I
and
see.
we
Right.
get caught up in our own histories and in our own path dependencies.
Hmm.
And uh, there's a lot written about how Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk really believed, that they were children of Munich. That was in their
Yeah.
formative years, and they
Yeah.
really believed in this domino theory. And then, of course, there were other problems about just getting caught up in a bureaucracy, and then there was the problem of all the China experts were basically thrown out of the State Department under McCarthy's time and things like that. So we had a very small knowledge base. But leadership really believed in the problems of Munich.
Yeah. I was reading about all the assassination attempts on Hitler. There's like 34 of them or something like that. One of which was at Munich. By his own generals were plotting to eliminate him because if the West stood up to him, they would have, well,
It
the
would have
United
been
States, right?
finished.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
right. Yeah. All right. You quote here that in 2022, the United States spent 1.12 trillion. That's 1,120 million a billion dollars just in 2022. This expenditure created approximately 800,000 civilian jobs and 1.3 million active duty jobs. But could these funds have created larger economic growth if applied to other areas? All right, how do you make that calculation of how much is it
Well,
worth?
first, I'm happy you read the book.
You're welcome. I do
uh,
that.
yeah, it's how do I think in a couple of paragraphs later on in the same chapter, I use the example of home insurance. How much home insurance do
Mm,
you need on your
yeah,
house
right.
against you're in California against fire and earthquakes? Um, really, you don't know. It's insurance, and military spending is insurance. Um, do you spend too much in insurance? Oftentimes, I think in the book I use the example. We had bought a house, an old 1929 house, a 27 house, and the oil tank was buried in the front yard, actually, the old oil tank. And my brother in law, who was a very good attorney, said, "You must have oil tank insurance." I said, "Leave me alone." And because it cost a fortune. And he said, "No, no, you need oil tank insurance." And eventually he got on my case and we got the oil tank insurance. 5 years later, this old oil tank did begin to degrade, leaked into the ground. We were polluting a little brook, which ran into a little stream, which ran into the Long Island Sound here in New York. The EPA, everybody was on our case. It took, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to stop all this. Fortunately, we had oil tank insurance.
Really?
Yeah,
Oh my
because
God. That's
I
crazy.
listened to my brother-in-law. The oil
It's
tank
really funny.
insurance paid for it. Well, it's the same thing with this military spending. Forgetting the jobs it you get out of it, and also you can't put aside all the technological creativity that comes from it. The internet came out of this spending. Parts of the iPhone came out of this spending. Tremendous technological um, development comes from the spending. But putting that aside, how much do you spend on insurance? And if you
Well,
would,
yeah, yeah. I was just thinking about that because I'm in California, up in the mountains, in Santa Barbara area, and I can't get insurance. I can't get fire insurance, but the state of California requires it, so they provide it as the insurer of last resort, and they charge a lot. So
right,
instead of paying like $1,500 a year for fire insurance, I'm paying like, I don't know, $8,000 a year for fire insurance.
correct.
But it's still worth it because if my house burned down, I'd be
Well,
finished.
exactly. So that's the same with the military. And unfortunately, there's no gauge or no rule of thumb that says, well, if you spend this much less on the military, you'll be better. You'll be
Yeah.
equally protected.
Okay, then another argument you'll hear is something like, well, what do you mean? What do we need that big a military for? They're not going to invade us. China's not coming across the Pacific Ocean. Russia's not coming across the Atlantic Ocean or into Alaska. I mean, what are we really worried about? And I guess your answer would be all these other countries that we do business with.
Or the other countries that we do business with, exactly. Plus our own business. I mean, one of the things about our defense spending and also about our defense spending and our being an international business country is, does the farmer in Iowa who's sending all their sweet soybeans abroad really know that it's the U.S. Seventh Fleet that's protecting these shipments?
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, the reason the market is open for him is because there's a supply chain that's protected with
Yeah.
this insurance.
All right. Other reasons we're doing this. United States has agreed to treaties obligating it to the defense of 51 countries. You list 28 countries in NATO, which is essentially a defense umbrella for Canada and most of Europe. 18 countries, the Rio Treaty that applies to most of Central and South America, the ANZUS, ANZUS Treaty with Australia and New Zealand, bilateral treaty with Japan, bilateral treaty with South Korea, bilateral treaty with the Philippines, and so on. So in many ways, we're obligated by treaty to have a military presence in those regions.
So, correct. But once again, these treaties protect us. I mean, like NATO protects us. You know, it's most people don't realize, for instance, that Europe, not China, is our largest trading partner, the European
Hmm.
Union. I mean, I'm talking about the 27 nations together, okay?
Hmm.
Not just Germany or France separately. I mean, who protects that trade? Once again, who protect? That's our marketplace.
Hmm.
And if Mr. Putin's successful in Ukraine and then goes into Poland, I mean, once again, Europe has been at peace. It's a miracle since 1945. But partly it's at peace since 1945 because that NATO umbrella guarantees that peace.
Right. Yeah. That's the argument for maintaining NATO. What about Trump's claims that they aren't paying their fair share and therefore we got to bring them to the table and all that?
It's totally not so.
Really? That's just an incorrect
That's
fact that what
that's
he
Trump
says?
making up numbers. That's Trump making. So some countries might not be paying their share, but in general, most countries are paying their share or more. It's like
Hmm.
Trump made the statement the other day that we're paying the most, or a percentage of our GDP, we're paying the most for the Ukraine. That's absolutely not so. Europe's paying more.
Hmm. Interesting.
I mean,
Good.
Trump has, this amazing ability to make up numbers or to tell the person who's going to buy one of his condos that no one's going to block your view when someone builds a new building in front of it the next day.
Right.
He's a huge condo salesman and he makes up what's necessary to make a sale.
Wasn't there a story about how he started the count of his building stories at he called the first floor or the second floor the 10th floor, and
Yeah,
then just
I
started
don't
counting
know,
from
but it
there.
could very well be.
Yeah. It's too funny. Well, okay, so they're paying their fair share and so on. What are the other arguments against this? Do we really need 900 bases like RFKJ says? Yes, you're arguing we do for all these reasons and so on. So, what are we doing in Israel? What are the reasons we're supporting Israel politically, economically, democratically, morally?
Oh, here it's more difficult. I don't Although Israel, before this recent war, was the second Silicon Valley of the world, but obviously that's not why we're supporting them. This goes back historically to the United States as a nation. As you know, our first foreign war was in the Mideast, the Barbary Wars. Um, but then you go into the Judeo-Christian influence in the United States. You go around America, eh, in every state, there are many, many towns with biblical names. I mean, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania comes right to mind, but you have Goshen, New York. You can go wherever. If it's not a Spanish or a Native American name, it's a biblical name generally. Um, it's part of who we are. This belief in Ben Franklin, and then later on, uh, Ronald Reagan even compared us to Jerusalem, to the city on the hill. Um, Abraham Lincoln, and this is absolutely true. Shortly before he was assassinated, tells his wife that after he retires from presidency, he wants to go visit the Holy Land. So it's part of it's part of who we are as a mainly Christian and somewhat Judeo nation. And then we have the influential lobbies of both the conservative Christians and some of the American Jews who are very Zionistic, both together lobbying for Israel. Um, so I think that's why we're there. I mean, it's a you mentioned moral reasons. This is a religious, cultural, historic reasons of who we are as a people.
Yeah. What do you make of the post October 7th event and the increase in student protests against Israel? Whereas, liberals used to support the Jews as a minority, oppressed minority. And then all of a sudden we have this new shift. What do you make of that? From the river to the sea. I mean, that implies not just disagreement with Israeli policy, but no Israel at all.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the Israeli government has never been good at PR
Mm,
and has really failed here dramatically. Obviously, what was it, 1,100, 1,300 people killed October 7th in Israel. And as a percent of their population, it was dramatically greater than our population killed on 9/11.
yeah.
Um, um, did Netanyahu uh, act politically instead of strategically? I think there's no question about it, which makes the whole thing much more confusing.
Right. Another surprise turnaround with, oh, well, let me just add one more thing there. Part of that, I wouldn't call it liberal, but progressive philosophy is structuring everything as there is an oppressor and an oppressed, a colonizer and a colonized, and therefore a good and then an evil. And Israel, as a successful industrial colonizing capitalist nation, can
Yeah,
only
it
be
becomes
bad.
very black and white and very strange, in fact, to me, because here in front of my apartment in New York, there was a parade for gays and lesbians for Hamas.
Right.
So to me,
Right.
that was very strange.
Yes, indeed.
So,
If gays and lesbians went over there, they'd throw them off the roof.
correct.
Yeah.
So, and in fact, Tel Aviv has always been more or less the gay capital of Europe. So it's very strange to me how people act in that respect. Yes, by believing that black and white, the oppressor and the oppressed. Also, as I would, I think, and I don't want to simplify it because I think to these people it is a very moral and painful issue. But I
Yeah.
think students also in springtime rebel a little bit,
Mhm.
and that's not uncommon in America or in Europe or in South America. Probably not rebel is the wrong word, but demonstrate, and I think the students here partly bought into that. Um,
It's energizing to have a moral cause to get animated about.
yeah, I think. Look, I think Israel morally has has not been the best for sure. Um, it it's. I was talking to a fellow professor about this actually yesterday. Um, Israel sadly doesn't look at the world with the clarity that we look at the world because once again I'm repeating myself now a couple of times with this term path dependency. Their path dependency is disaster. Their path dependency is annihilation or being thrown out, whether it was in Spain or 1492 or the Nazis. So their path dependency is being thrown out or or execution. So that makes you view the world much differently. And and I think we all need that's not to excuse Israel's actions, but I think we have to understand that action and where they're
Yeah.
coming from.
Yeah, I agree. When I was writing my book on the Holocaust deniers, and I read about the Holocaust, and I read about all the pogroms and anti-Semitism through history, so then I really understood what "never again" means. I mean, they finally just said, "You do this again, you try to do this again, we are gonna kick your ass, and we're not backing down." It's like, yeah, okay, I get that.
Right. And and I think forgetting Netanyahu's corruption problem, I
Yeah.
think somewhere in the back of his mind, he says, every day we've survived longer than ever before.
Hmm. Right.
And we don't think I mean, in America, that concept that for Americans, we don't think like that.
Right. Yes, I think also, though, 1948 is recent enough in history, this idea that they're colonizers and they should give the land back or whatever. Well, everybody's a colonizer in history if you go
Yeah,
back
I
far
mean
enough.
that's true. I mean that is what happened in the Middle East in terms of the king of Jordan, the Hashemite Empire. They're not Jordanian. They were put there by Churchill. So you can.
Right. Yeah. 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 And then what do you make of the shift in the GOP or conservatives in general, or maybe they're just Trumpian mega people, cozying up to autocrats and dictators and this sort of thing? I mean, Reagan would have been appalled. I just had Max Boot on the show for his new Reagan biography. It's great. I mean, Reagan was definitely a staunch internationalist in this sense. Presume he'd be shocked by this cozying up to these type
Yeah,
of people.
I frankly don't understand it. I just absolutely don't understand it because it goes against every American value. I mean, getting back to NATO and the EU, I mean, we with share cultural values, we share democracy, we share freedom of the press, we share capitalism, we share culture. What cultural values do we share with these people that totally, we talk about the Enlightenment. These people are totally anti-Enlightenment. I frankly don't understand it, unless there is some financial support coming from somewhere.
Yeah, it could be. Although you see someone like Tucker Carlson and his, just insane trips to Russia. What a wonderful place this is, and
Right,
Putin regales him for hours about the history of Russia, and this would have never happened with anybody else.
right. Well, it's interesting how little Trump knows about. Once again, I had mentioned he didn't know much about history before, but what he does, he made the statement: Russia never loses.
Right,
Russia lost the war against Japan. Russia lost World War One. In World War One, they gave Ukraine and Poland back not back. They gave in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with Lenin, gave the Ukraine and Poland to Germany.
right,
They gave away a third of their country, a million square miles of land. They gave to Germany. They lost World War One. World War Two, one of the prime reasons they won is because we were the arsenal of democracy because of Roosevelt's Lend-Lease.
right.
They lost the Cold War. They lost in Afghanistan, but we can't say we won in Afghanistan either. But they lost in Afghanistan. I mean, they have a very small record of winning, and Trump makes this public statement: Russia never loses a war.
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess we have our own fair share of the March of Folly you talk about. That's Barbara. The name of Barbara Tuchman's a great book on that. So I guess you might put maybe not Afghanistan, but Iraq in that category.
Oh yeah, I mean we lose. I'm not saying we don't lose wars, or we don't. We get involved in swamps, in
Yeah.
muddles. But I'm just saying we don't have a statement like Trump saying
Right. Right.
Russia never loses wars.
Right. All right. Last hot spot here, China. You think they're going to invade Taiwan, and what will we do about it if they do?
That's an interesting point. Once again, I think it's Ukraine is relative. What happens in Ukraine?
Hmm.
Um, do do you get punished for doing something or not getting punished? Um, Look, Taiwan. There's an argument, obviously, from the Chinese side that the back at the time of the revolution, the Kuomintang lost the battle, lost the war rather, took a lot of the Chinese gold and antiquities to Taiwan and set up the government there. in the government from the Chinese point of view. It's always been illegitimate, and it makes questions Beijing's legitimacy.
Hmm.
But that was a long time ago. 1949 has become a long time ago, and Taiwan has developed into its own very successful country. Uh, I think China has tremendous problems at the moment. The government's legitimacy has, since Deng Xiaoping, been based on economic growth. Now now that's falling. Probably the biggest threat to the world that no one is talking about in the American political campaign because it's too complicated is Chinese deflation. Uh, you have Chinese deflation. Was a new figure mentioned in the Financial Times the other day that by 2036, I think, if I'm quoting it correctly, 30% of the Chinese population will be senior citizens. They have a tremendous debt problem. The rose is kind of off of the Chinese great economic miracle, and it was a great economic miracle. But I think she has partly been involved in that not moving forward by limiting knowledge in an era when human capital is everything, by basically threatening entrepreneurs. So the society has definitely become a lot less entrepreneurial, and he's funding more money into state businesses. So I think he's been part of the reason for the growth slowing down. So what do they do to rectify this? And what does the party do? Maybe become more nationalistic. That's one of the historical patterns we see around the world. When an autocratic government is threatened, they become more nationalistic. So maybe that means invading Taiwan. But I don't know that will happen. But I think there's a small possibility it might.
Yeah. Wasn't there some issue with tech and that Taiwan has these chip making companies that Xi has been unable to replicate in China?
Well, with the tech issue, Taiwan is the chip capital of the world.
Yeah.
I never have been able to understand why China can't duplicate these chips.
Right.
But they don't seem to be able to. So, if you grab Taiwan, you get this chip industry. Now, will you really get the chip industry, or could the chip industry not survive under? Can a human capital industry not survive under a totalitarian rule? It used to be for a totalitarian government of a major economic power, it used to be so much easier. I mean, Khrushchev would always say, "We will surpass you." It's not easy, but not difficult to build a steel mill and have 2,000 people banging. But when the world's economy really has changed from the industrial age to the human capital age, that's more difficult to control.
Mm-hmm. I forgot to ask about North Korea as a hotspot. Do you think anybody in the inside there could overthrow that regime? Is there any more or any more pressures we could put on? I mean, we've done everything.
I don't know how it works there, and I think very few of us do.
Yeah,
and it's one of those places where I think you have someone who does not act in terms of normal human behavior, in terms of their responsibility to the population. So who knows?
Yeah. I was just in South Korea, by the way. I was in Seoul for this conference, where, by the way, Arthur Laffer was also one of the speakers. And of course, he got pushed pretty hard about Trump. He says, "Oh, Trump's not really an economic nationalist or a big guy on tariffs. That's all bullshit just to get people to the table because he's a tough negotiator.
Uh,
Oh, okay.
but what's amazing about the tariffs, and I just finished an essay on it actually, so it's hot in my head,
Yeah.
is that one, it's an easy sell. It's a perfect political slogan because it's building up an economic war against the other guy. Now, we know historically tariffs are an absolute disaster. We know it from the late 1920s that Smoot-Hawley, if not the cause of the Great Depression, it was one of the nails on the coffin. We know that it strangled world trade. We know that tariffs are tit for tat. If we put on a tariff, the other guy puts on a tariff. Then we put on more tariffs. So we know that it stops innovation. We know that it just raises prices domestically because you're not allowing the competition in. It's an economic disaster. How do you explain that in the soundbite against a tariff? We need
Right.
tariffs. It's
Well,
difficult.
but in reality, the consumer pays the tariff, right?
With totally the court, I forgot in my being pedantic camp, I forgot also it raises the price of goods. Not only does the local domestic manufacturer able to raise his or her prices, the imported prices go up. Tariffs are a tax on imports. They
Yeah.
are tax. The exporting country does not pay the tariff.
Hmm. Right.
But once again, if you look at it, it's a war. Tariffs are war. And you look at it, we're going to build this tariff war against the United States again. It's very similar to the war against the migrants. How do you argue against it? You can't, a talking point isn't, well, in 1929, Smoot-Hawley was an absolute failure and basically was one of the causes of the Great Depression. That's not a talking point against it and a political
Mm,
slogan.
amazing. Right. By the way, when I was there, I took a day off to go to the DMZ.
Oh,
I hired a
very
guide,
interesting.
and I wanted to see, the famous spots. Well, and I saw a couple spots, but the famous one with the blue buildings where Trump went, and the guards are on each side,
Right.
and you can, and he stepped over with Kim there, and so on. You can't go there anymore because last year that crazy American soldier ran across the border and they
Um,
arrested him. So they've closed it off to
uh,
tourism. Darn it. Okay, last point here, Edward. Are you worried about I don't know, an American Civil War or breakdown of civility and democracy? I've heard each side say if the other side wins, it's the end of democracy, and so on. And I don't see the pathway to it, but I do worry about political violence increasing.
I'm worried about violence, not a civil war.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm worried about like the January 6th violence.
Yeah.
And I'm amazed. What I'm amazed at is what my fellow citizens believe, honestly. Like Trump at several rallies has talked about sending your little boy to school and he gets an operation, he comes home a girl.
Yeah.
And people sit there and believe that.
Yeah.
So I'm amazed what my fellow citizens believe. Okay. Uh,
Well, first, they're not zero cases where these things have happened on both sides. I had a podcast guest talking about how conservatives are murdering women. It's like, what are you talking about? Well, they're bleeding out in abortion clinics, because they can't get an abortion. Well, how many of these have happened? Well, a few,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
you know,
So I think we've gone beyond. I think our rhetoric is moving into a dangerous place.
are you confident though in the Constitution, the Supreme Court, the rule of law, the local courts, that they're not going to fall down? The military's not going to do something crazy?
I'm this is going out on a limb, boy, but I'm always impressed by all the military leaders I've met. They're very educated, very broad thinkers. Not everybody, but I think we're very blessed in the United States that we have a very educated and broad thinking military leadership. Uh, um, no, I believe it. I believe the rule of law is embedded in the majority of our citizens' culture and how they act. And so I believe it will hold.
Yeah, I do too. If we take a long view of history, say going back 500 years to this Westphalian idea you talked about, and then going forward, I don't know, another 500 years of this, could you see a day when it would be nothing but democracies and borders would just be really porous economic trade regions, but not political borders with walls and so
Actually,
on?
I don't know. One, I think the world is getting, because of technology, it's going through changes quicker maybe than humans can deal with.
Hmm.
And I think that's causing some of the populism we have now. The society is changing too quickly. Um, I don't think we're going to have a world of democracies in 500 years. I think democracies are culturally specific.
Hmm.
During the 1990s, there was a belief that if China became rich, it would become a democracy.
Hmm.
But then, in retrospect, that was very naive. China was
Hmm.
a democracy. China is one of the oldest countries, cultures in the world, what, 5,000 years or more? And it was a democracy, a partial democracy, for 8 or 10 years during Sun Yat sen's time.
Hmm.
And so in the 1920s, and it was previously, before the European age of exploration, the richest country in the world. So
Hmm.
why should China be a democracy?
Hmm.
Why is
Right.
it? So I don't know if democracy is the future for every country.
Maybe
Well,
we'll get back to city states.
excuse me.
Maybe we'll get back to city states.
We might get back to city states, right?
Because no small city state can afford nuclear weapons. That's my
Right.
argument there. All right, Edward, that was great. Thank you so much. We'll have you on in a year from now and reassess how we're doing if we're still
Michael, it was
around.
great. It was fun.